It was an ordinary day at the department store when I first noticed the little girl, tears streaming down her cheeks, standing alone in the crowded aisle. She was nervously gripping the edge of her skirt, her eyes darting around, clearly lost. My heart immediately went out to her as I approached cautiously. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked gently, trying not to startle her. She looked up at me, her small face etched with worry, but softened when I smiled. "I'm Emma," she replied hesitantly. "I came with my dad, but I can't find him." I reassured her and offered to help. Together, we walked to the store's lost and found, where, to my relief, a man stood talking to the attendant. As soon as Emma saw him, she squealed, "Daddy!" The man, who I later learned was named Liam, rushed over to scoop his daughter up into a tight hug, apologizing profusely for losing track of her. I thought that was the end of it, but in that moment, Liam looked up at me and invited me to coffee as a thank you. It seemed like a simple gesture, but little did I know that it would be the start of something that would change my life forever. My name is Olivia, and I'm now 47 years old. Looking back, I realized that meeting Liam and Emma that day set the course for my future in ways I never could have predicted. After that initial coffee, Liam and I began seeing each other more regularly. He was a single father, raising Emma on his own after his wife had passed away shortly after giving birth. At first, I was hesitant about entering a relationship with someone who had so much emotional baggage, but Emma's sweetness and Liam's gentle nature slowly drew me in. My parents were skeptical at first, concerned that I was taking on too much by getting involved with a man who had a child. But eventually, they came around, and I married Liam a year later. For a while, it felt like everything was perfect. I loved Emma as if she were my own daughter, and Liam seemed like the perfect husband, kind, caring, and attentive. But as time went on, cracks began to form in the seemingly perfect facade of our marriage. Liam's kindness, which had drawn me to him, started to fade, replaced by something much colder, much darker. It wasn't an overnight change. At first, I barely noticed it. Liam's small criticisms seemed harmless, just the usual frustrations of life. But over time, those small remarks turned into constant complaints. "Is dinner ready? Why isn't the house clean? You're not doing enough for Emma." His tone became more demanding, more dismissive, as if I was no longer his wife but his servant. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just stress or work that was making him act this way. But the more I excused his behavior, the worse it became. He started drinking heavily, coming home late with the scent of alcohol and expensive cologne lingering on his clothes. When I asked him where he'd been, his answers were vague and evasive. The man who had once been so gentle and attentive had turned into someone I barely recognized. It was around this time that I suggested adopting Emma officially, making her legally my daughter. But Liam shot down the idea immediately, saying it was unnecessary and too much of a hassle. That was when I knew something was deeply wrong. The man I had fallen in love with was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. As the years passed, things only got worse. Liam no longer treated me like his partner. I was nothing more than the housekeeper in his eyes. "Make sure dinner's on the table when I get home," he'd bark at me, without so much as a thank you or even a smile. His demands became constant, and no matter how much I did, it was never enough. If the house wasn't spotless, he'd find something to criticize. If I missed one small thing, his temper would flare. And it wasn't just household chores. He even expected me to manage his personal affairs, like setting his alarm and laying out his clothes. It was humiliating. Meanwhile, I was also the one shouldering most of the financial burden. Liam's drinking and spending habits left little room for him to contribute to our expenses, and I had to cover the bills to keep our household running. Every day felt like a losing battle, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. But no matter how bad things got, there was one bright spot in my life: Emma. Even as Liam grew more distant and hostile, Emma remained my anchor, the one thing that made it all worth enduring. Emma had grown into a smart and compassionate young woman, and despite the tension at home, she was always there for me. She could see the strain between Liam and me, and though I tried to shield her from the worst of it, she wasn't blind to how badly her father treated me. One evening, after Liam had launched into yet another tirade about the dinner being cold, Emma stood up from the table, her voice trembling with anger. "Stop being so mean to Mama," she yelled, her small frame shaking with emotion. Liam, for once, was speechless. He stared at her for a moment before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind him. After he left, Emma came over to me, her eyes filled with concern. "Don't worry, Mama. I'll protect you," she whispered, wrapping her arms around me. Her words broke my heart because it was supposed to be the other way around. I was supposed to protect her. But in that moment, I realized just how much I relied on her strength. Emma was the only reason I hadn't walked out on Liam already. She was my only salvation in a marriage that had long since turned into a prison. Time passed, and Emma grew older, eventually graduating from college and landing a good job at a major company. She could have moved out, started her own life, but she chose to stay with me. "I'm worried about you, Mama," she said, when I asked why she hadn't moved into her own place yet. Part of me was relieved to have her there, but another part of me felt guilty. I didn't want her to feel responsible for me, but despite my objections, she insisted. Eventually, I accepted it. I taught her how to manage the household chores and insisted she contribute financially, even though it pained me to take money from her. Liam, meanwhile, continued his downward spiral. His drinking worsened, and his verbal abuse became more frequent. Though he never laid a hand on me, the way he threw things around the house in fits of rage made it clear he was trying to intimidate me. The only thing that kept me going was Emma. She always stood up for me, even when Liam's harsh words were directed at her. But as much as I appreciated her support, I knew I couldn't let this go on forever. Something had to change. The turning point came when Emma introduced me to her boyfriend, William. He was calm, kind, and treated Emma with the respect and love she deserved. I could see from the way he looked at her that he would take care of her in ways Liam never had. When Emma told us that William had proposed, I was overjoyed, but Liam, true to form, had to spoil the moment. "You could do better than him," he scoffed, "someone who makes more money." Emma's face fell, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. But before I could say anything, William spoke up, his voice steady and unwavering. "You're right," he said. "Emma is too good for me. I'm the luckiest man in the world that she chose me." His words, so full of humility and love, made Emma's face light up again, and I knew in that moment that William was the right man for her. Liam, on the other hand, had no response. He just scowled and retreated into his usual silence. It was clear that Emma had made her decision, and nothing Liam said would change it. The wedding was set, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. As the wedding preparations went on, Liam became more distant, his behavior more erratic. He stopped coming home altogether some nights, and when he did, he barely acknowledged me. I knew something was going on, but I didn't have the energy to confront him. I was too focused on helping Emma plan her wedding. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but Liam's growing hostility loomed over everything like a dark cloud. Then, one evening, just as Emma and I were finalizing the details of her dress fitting, Liam dropped a bombshell. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, a stack of papers in his hand. Divorce papers. "Emma's getting married soon, and you've served your purpose. It's time for a divorce," he said with a smirk that made my stomach turn. I stared at him in disbelief, the weight of his words crashing down on me. After all the years of abuse, after everything I had endured for the sake of our family, he was discarding me like I was nothing. "You won't be coming to the wedding," he added. "You're a stranger to me now." His words cut deeper than any insult he had ever hurled at me. For a moment, I sat there in stunned silence, the divorce papers staring up at me like a final, cruel joke. Liam had made my life a living hell for years. But this was the ultimate betrayal. I had sacrificed everything for him and for Emma. Logically, and now he was casting me aside like I had never mattered. But then, something inside me shifted. I wasn't the broken woman he thought I was. I had endured too much to let him have the last word. Fine, I said, my voice steady. We'll divorce, but you'll regret this. Liam's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. You? Regret? Don't make me laugh. You're nothing without me, he sneered. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood up, packed my things, and left that house for good. I went straight to my parents' home, where they welcomed me with open arms. As I told them everything, they were furious with Liam, but also saddened that I hadn't come to them sooner. Their support gave me the strength I needed to move forward. The next day, I filed the divorce papers, knowing that I was finally free from the man who had caused me so much pain. What I didn't expect was the confrontation that came soon after. Just as I had settled into my parents' home, I heard a knock on the door. To my shock, it was Emma, her face red and tear-streaked. "Why didn't you tell me?" she cried, storming into the house. "Dad called me last night gloating about how he'd finally divorced the housekeeper and said you wouldn't be at the wedding. How could you not tell me?" Her words were filled with pain, but beneath that, I could see the fear of losing me. I tried to explain that I hadn't wanted to burden her, especially not with her wedding coming up, but Emma wouldn't hear it. "You're my mother, no matter what," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I want you at the wedding. I don't care what Dad says." Her determination took me by surprise, but more than that, it filled me with a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. Emma didn't see me as a stranger, or just her father's wife. She saw me as her mother in every way that mattered. In that moment, I knew that no matter what happened with Liam, I still had my daughter, and that was all I needed. The day of Emma's wedding finally arrived, and true to her word, Liam was nowhere to be found. Emma had made it clear that he wasn't welcome, not after everything he had put us through. As I stood by her side, watching her marry William, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. Emma looked radiant in her wedding dress, her happiness shining brighter than I had ever seen before. All the years of pain, all the sacrifices I had made, suddenly seemed worth it. I had raised a strong, compassionate woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. After the ceremony, Emma and William asked if I would move in with them, into their new home. As tempting as the offer was, I declined. "You two need to start your life together," I told them with a smile, "but I'll be nearby and I'll always be here if you need me." They understood, and though I was sad to let her go, I knew it was the right decision. Emma deserved a fresh start, free from the shadows of the past. And so did I. In the months that followed, I began the process of rebuilding my life. I consulted a lawyer, not only to finalize the divorce, but to demand compensation from Liam for the years of emotional abuse I had endured. I had kept meticulous records of his behavior, and with the evidence I had gathered, my case was strong. I also learned that I could still pursue the possibility of legally adopting Emma, even though Liam and I were no longer together. It wasn't about the paperwork. It was about solidifying the bond that had grown between us over the years. Emma had always been my daughter in my heart, and I wanted to make that official. As I sat in my new apartment, not far from Emma and William's home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The fear and anxiety that had once consumed me were gone, replaced by hope and a quiet strength. I had lost a husband, but I had gained something far more valuable: a daughter, a family, and the knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever realized. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.